the opposite is true. So-called abortion is an act of violence. It's the poisoning or tearing apart of an unborn child, and it's this reality they have so deliberately concealed with these images. There's a lot that's bizarre about these images. One is the fact they're white, so clearly they've got rid of the blood somehow, which is interesting, because if they're trying to depict what a woman is likely to see after an early stage medical abortion, it's not going to be white. There's going to be a lot of blood there. But they've also managed to conceal the unborn child, which we know is clearly discernible and visible from certainly in those later 8, 9, 10 weeks. Hello and welcome back to this week's About Abortion episode. I'm joined once again by Christian Hacking, and we're carrying on our discussion of lies in the public sphere and the censoring of truth when it comes to abortion. And the title of this week's episode is Cruikshank Returns, The Guardian Whitewashes a Genocide. Now, maybe you're asking who's Cruikshank. We'll introduce him in just a bit. But before we go any further, since, Christian, we are talking about The Guardian today, which describes itself as fiercely independent, a bastion of the truth, not owned by any sort of oligarch who controls its message. You've got an interesting insight into the behind-the-scenes workings of The Guardian, which I know our listeners have been waiting all week long at the edge of their seats to hear. So tell us, what are these...
Pining. So far on the edge of their seats, they're developing pressure sores. They wanted to find this out so much. So what is this information? Is that the question you're about to ask? Yeah,
tell us what are these communications that you sort of unwittingly received?
Well, if you were listening last week to this podcast, you would have known that we went on a whistle-stop tour of the inner mental workings of MP Stella Creasy. And part of this kind of discussion around free speech and her kind of attempt to repaint what free speech is, and the closing of free speech that she so willingly took part in the winter of 2019, was the role of the press to basically spout lies about harassment and intimidation. What happened after the CBR UK campaign was another group, a political organisation called the Christian Parties Alliance, ran their own campaign in Walthamstow, and I had the privilege of receiving a text message from a journalist who was trying to contact Stella Creasy about what this campaign was doing in her area. And let me just share my screen with you. And so beeping on my Samsung 5S phone was this. Can you see a text from Mark Townsend? Yeah. Brilliant. So this is a text from Mark Townsend, and it says, "Hey Stella, good to talk, and sorry they are still up to their awful behavior, full stop. I'll write the piece up, get it over to you via email tomorrow morning, and up on the Guardian website by lunch, latest, full stop. Glad to be of service, ! Regards, Mark." To which I then got other messages from him saying, "Hi Christian, hope you're well. Are you around? ? Regards, Mark." Obviously that first message not meant for you. End of text thread. Now, I am delighted to share this with you a good 3 years after it was first sent to us, or 2 years, because it really goes to show that these politicians don't operate in a vacuum, that they have media contacts and liaisons, and they work for each other and they work closely with each other. And should it surprise us that The Guardian, who has come up with all kinds of kind of borderline defamation, slanderous headlines about us, but not borderline, I would argue, should be in cahoots with Stella Creasy in producing more, misinformation? The answer is absolutely not, because this is the nature of the beast that we're fighting against. which is the Guardian, which at one point really was a guardian of free speech and minority views, has just careered so far left that they are on the brink, if they already haven't got there, of just total insanity. And what you get from them is not the guarding of free speech, the guarding of the news as it is meant to be, but actually just unadulterated political agendas being pushed, of which obviously climate change. Over the summer, every single headline I saw of theirs appeared to be some kind of climate change related issue. People's house fires weren't reported as house fires; they were reported as proof of global warming, etc. And they've also got headlong behind the pro-abortion agenda, of which we are exploring the latest manifestation of that in this stuff. It's also worth noting that The Guardian, because it is donor funded, and that's why you have to read the donor pledge kind of every article you read with them, they are also susceptible to lots of kind of paid international journalism. So for example, when people were trying to stop DIY, abortion pill reversal with Dr. Dermot Kiernan or Kearney, they basically Open Democracy was supplying, that's George Soros's kind of media wing, was supplying information to journalists, funding journalists, who were then submitting it to The Guardian. And The Guardian articles at the time had a kind of little disclaimer saying, this is funded by open source, open democracy, etc. I see less of those tags nowadays, so maybe they're going more covert in their funding streams, but basically they've not only opened themselves up to kind of political manipulation from global elites, etc., but it seems like they've willingly endorsed a lot of it, and basically taking their readership on an absolute fool's errand, really, of which the article that we're going to be looking at today is a prime example of this.
Yeah, and quite aside from the money trail and whether anything illegal or untoward is happening at a kind of procedural level, quite aside from that, I want people to see and appreciate the significance of the way in which The Guardian is effectively the propaganda arm of the abortion lobby, which is incredibly powerful in Parliament, as well as in, for example, the Royal College of Obs and Gynae, the British Medical Association. Now, again, I'm not saying we're still talking mostly about soft totalitarianism here rather than the hard. It's cultural Marxism rather than political. So we've seen a takeover of the academies. We're seeing a takeover of the various institutions, largely Parliament, and certainly much of the mainstream media. And I happen to think that one of the greatest problems with the UK Church today, practically speaking, is we all too easily believe what the mainstream media says. People still listen to the BBC, read The Guardian in particular, uncritically, and quote and repeat what's been said there as if it is fact, as if there is no agenda behind it. And the piece we're going to show you now is a really clear example proving that the opposite is true. There is a very strong agenda going on here, and quite aside from who's paying who, it's clear from that text you showed us, Christian, that Stella is almost acting there as a sort of an informal, unofficial editor for The Guardian. I'll send it over first thing in the morning, and then once I get the okay from you, I'll publish it by lunchtime. Yeah. I mean, it's almost ghostwriting. Quite aside, it's not official. It's not in sort of organisational terms. The government's newspaper or the Labour Party's newspaper or the abortion lobby's newspaper, but in practical terms, that's pretty much what it is.
Yeah, and it's just worth noting, someone like Stella Creasy has huge editorial clout, right? Which is, when we did the CPN, we lined up a piece in the Times through the help of some friends of ours, and this very meticulous journalist came out and interviewed me, kind of cross-examined me for about over an hour or two to really get to the facts of the case. And he was due to write some kind of piece, really kind of telling our story, stuff that we reflected in the last interview. But when he went to Stella Creasy, everything turned on its head, right? So an interview about kind of the, unfair sort of local council powers to silence opposition and silence political speech basically became a headline. MP blasts, anti-choice activists. So she has huge political clout. And when it came to, with the Stop Stella campaign, we were invited to go speak on the BBC or one of these other kind of mainstream media outlets. And I think Stella refused to be on a panel with us. So she really has a very powerful right of veto, and is very respected within these circles. Again, meaning that so many of her ideas can't be publicly challenged, and so she keeps a real tight editorial, grip on lots of her content. So that's another example of all of that. Anyway, do you want me to share the article? So those
So let me introduce this. So what we're going to show people now, and actually showing might not work so well. We'll talk people through it and give a summary. But this is an article that came out about a week or two ago. So again, timing interesting, seemed to kind of coincide with abortion debate generally, but in particular the buffer zones thing. And for those who are watching on YouTube, you can see this on our screen share. But for those who are just listening, let me just describe it to you. Perhaps, Christian, you could kindly just scroll through gently so that people can see this. So this is an article that has the title, What a Pregnancy Actually Looks Like Before 10 Weeks in Pictures. And it introduces the issue of Roe v. Wade and so on, and says, the issue is we very rarely see what pregnancy tissue at early stages looks like. There's a series of pictures, which we're scrolling through just now, which mysteriously feature white tissue, blobs of tissue, which are totally undiscernible. I mean, you can't tell what these things are. They almost look like, it could be larvae, it could be anything, through various stages of pregnancy. So 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and so on. All of these, and there's a ruler next to it for scale. And this is showing what pregnancy tissue actually looks like. Now, in none of these can you see anything resembling a human embryo. And that point is repeatedly made in the text. You can't see anything here that looks anything like a fetus. And it goes right up to, what is it, Christian? It's go up to 8 weeks, 10 weeks. What the upper... We've got 8 weeks there. And we've got 9 weeks, 10 weeks. I think 10 weeks might be as far as it goes, right? So 10 weeks. So most abortions taking place around the 10-week mark or slightly later. Worth noting, this is gestational stage measured from LMP. So that is from the last period. So it is, if you want the age of the unborn from fertilization, you have to take away 2 weeks from each of these measurements. So many people will measure pregnancy from LMP, but it's 2 weeks later when fertilization actually takes place. Now,
that's an average.
Sure.
The point about last menstrual period is the pregnancy can take place at any point from the last menstrual period to your next menstrual period. So in lots of these pictures, you could be dealing with, the aging of them from last LMP could be entirely misleading, because that baby could either be a few days old or it could be 4 weeks old. And this is something, I think we'll examine in a moment when we look at the MYA network, and you'll see just their methodology and how skewed it is in making this point.
And that's why CBR UK and other organisations deliberately use from fertilisation dating, because it's far more accurate, because that's actually measuring from when that life has begun, whereas LMP is notoriously inaccurate because of the discrepancy of when fertilisation may have taken place, as well as just irregularity of periods and so on. So So that's why we always date from fertilization. But in either case, whether and they don't hide that fact. They do explain their dating system there. But aside from that, this is just astonishingly and deliberately misleading. The claim, and I'll just read out a couple of quotes here from the article. The claim is they've got no axe to grind, no political agenda. They're not, for abortion or against abortion. They say this: we're just putting out the information and the facts to counter the misinformation. And by that, they refer to this explicitly, e.g., images of human embryos where you can actually see the embryo, where you can actually see the hands, the feet, the eyes, and so on. That's what they're calling misinformation, and these are accurate images. We'll go on to that in a minute. They carry on to say this is not something that's scary or dangerous or violent. It's just a picture of something that's in your body. And so in one line, they're contradicting themselves. They say they've got no agenda. They're just putting out the information, but then they clearly give away their purpose. Their purpose is to try and make it seem like there's nothing violent going on here. It's not scary or dangerous. Of course, the opposite is true. So-called abortion is an act of violence. It's the poisoning or tearing apart of an unborn child. And it's this reality they have so deliberately concealed with these images. There's a lot that's bizarre about these images. One is the fact they're white. So clearly they've got rid of the blood somehow, which is interesting, because if they're trying to depict what a woman is likely to see after an early stage medical abortion, it's not going to be white. There's going to be a lot of blood there. But they've also managed to conceal the unborn child, which we know is clearly discernible and visible from certainly in those later 8, 9, 10 weeks, very clearly, still small, but very clearly a baby. So Christian, can you explain what's going on here? What are these images? Are these totally made up? What have they done to kind of produce these?
Well, the best way to answer that is to go back to the article, right? And you'll see early from the third paragraph in the article, these images supplied to us by the MYA network, and it's got a hyperlink here. So if I click on that hyperlink, it goes through to the MYA website about the issue of tissue, and it has this lady with a video describing herself as a family doctor. And it starts with the question, do you know what early pregnancies actually look like? What's really interesting is if you go further down the page, you start to pick up what the agenda may be behind this. Wow. And in regard to what this organization is about, it's kind of got these quotes, right? It didn't look human like what you see in the apps. I felt a sense of ease, wrote one person. Sophia and Grandma, it wasn't what I expected at all. It was so small and seemed a lot less scary. We were comforted. It just looked like mucus. It was just a little thing, nothing that made us feel guilty. And finally, religious conflict. Being able to look at what it actually is removed all the scariness and the guilt. Okay, so as far as this article is neutral, it is not. This website is as charged as a Tesla on a front porch after a full night being plugged into the socket. And this is when it gets really remarkable, right? If you scroll down to the FAQs on the page, I'm going to read them if you can't get here. It starts answering a bunch of questions. What is pregnancy tissue? What is a gestational sac? What is an embryo? It also asks. But this is when it gets really interesting. Okay, an embryo is a cluster of cells that can develop into what we call a fetus in 8 to 10 weeks of pregnancy. Okay, so clear dehumanizing, a deconstructing of the fact that an embryo is a distinctive and whole human being. It's got its own genetic code. That it has that a beautiful kind of potassium iodide, thing that happens when it becomes a new human being, right? But this is where it gets really, really interesting. It says, what does the tissue look like inside prior to being removed? The picture above shows you what the tissue of early pregnancy looks like. When this tissue is removed during an in-office procedure, it looks the same, but we also see some of the menstrual lining, decidua, and some blood. Interesting. Okay, so it talks about these are kind of vacuum aspirations using what is probably a handheld pump. It keeps on referring to them as in-office. I don't know what point they're trying to make there. It says, how was the tissue removed? It talks about a manual uterine aspiration here. The procedure itself takes only about 5 minutes and does not require surgery or medicines to put the patient to sleep. Okay, but it does often require a painkiller injected around the cervix. So a number of details it's missed out there. It also requires, the stretching of the uterus to get in using a series of tools. It can sometimes require, pre-prep, the insertion of kind of a seaweed material that expands with moisture and again widens the cervix. So there's a breaking and entering here that's totally ignored. But this is perhaps the most pertinent point. Okay, it said one of the questions didn't look like this. Why?
Just say that again, Christian. We lost your signal there. Hang on, just
sorry,
give us the title there again.
So the title there says, so this is kind of the fifth question down on the FAQs on the website that provided the information for this article, right? And it says this, and it says, I took abortion pills and it didn't look like this. Why? Question mark. Okay, and now this is the key detail, okay, which really is the giveaway of this whole agenda here. It says, we rinsed off the blood and removed the menstrual lining, open brackets, decidua, close brackets, in preparation for these photos. What you see here is the gestational sac alone, full stop. Okay, if you are taking abortion pills at home and having miscarriage, what you see will look different. Most people will experience a heavy period, which may include blood clots of varying size, so it can be difficult to see the pregnancy tissue unless you purposefully look for it. If you are over 9 weeks pregnant and choose to look, you may see an early embryo. Okay, so it sounds, although they don't give all detail here, it sounds from their methodology like what they've done is they've literally washed away the baby, any other blood clots that could have the baby inside, and then they have, and then they've clearly presented it in a petri dish. So all you're really seeing is the gestational sac, and any evidence of an embryo or life, etc., is either washed away or it's being reduced and minimized by not using magnification. And this is what was one of perhaps the most interesting quote for me in the article, was this quote further down the page. And for those looking, you can see it. I'm going to read it out for those who are listening on the podcast. But basically, it says, further down the page, it says, this image shows the decidua, tissue to support the pregnancy, and the gestational sac, which would eventually become the amniotic sac, which supports the fetus. So they've kind of made this distinction between the sac and the fetus. Okay, if we look closer under a microscope, would we see more human qualities? Question mark. Okay, to which this Dr. Fleischmann says, if you zoom in on anything, including sperm and an egg getting fertilized, it's just an incredible thing to watch. But that's different from the everyday ways we see life. That perspective, to me, is the most relevant, but it is somehow absent from our consciousness. So again, it's like, so you've got this, okay, let's show people images of gestational sacs that have been washed away, potentially washing away the baby. And when asked, well, what happens if you zoom in? It's like, well, that's kind of irrelevant because that's not what you can see with the naked eye. So, how's that? How does that have any moral significance, right? It's the same argument to say, well, if I fire a missile, I may not see the destruction it does, 400 miles away. But, what matters is what I can see with my naked eye. Again, It's like, it's totally flawed, even from a human perspective. Introduce God's perspective, and we know God is not made in our image. We know God sees things very differently to how we see things. We know that, he even sees the very thought of adultery as an act of adultery, the act of murder as the act of getting angry as an act of murder. So certainly in God's book, the fact that we can't see it with our naked eye, I don't think takes away any moral culpability here. So again, we've got layers upon layers of deception, distortion, and this stuff is being played out in the public sphere. Because Dave, what was that story you told me about? Didn't somebody actually reference this particular article?
Yeah, I was going to come on to that actually. So we were doing a display in Norwich just the other day, and someone had clearly just seen this article, and they were claiming that our pictures were fake because she had seen what pregnancy actually looks like, and she's referencing this article. She said it looks nothing like what you're showing. So it just shows the impact it has when a trusted newspaper, a mainstream media outlet, rolls this stuff out, claiming here's the truth. Don't listen to the people on the other side. So it's very impactful. And clearly, just to pick up on the website, in case anyone wasn't able to see that, those who were able to see might have noticed, one of the tabs at the top is called Abortion Normalized. So clearly that is the agenda here. It's to make abortion not a big deal. So if zooming in and showing what's really there makes it feel like a big deal, we won't do that. If leaving the blood in the picture makes it a big deal, let's not do that. And they say that again in the article. It says this: showing this tissue in the way that they've kind of prepared it and doctored it, showing this tissue can be a relief to patients. For those who choose to look at the tissue, you can literally feel the tension coming down. And they're like, you're kidding? This is all that it was? So this is clearly the agenda here. It's to try and normalize abortion. It's the kind of visual equivalent to what you see in the verbal descriptions, so-called, of abortion by the providers. They say, look, it's just a gentle suction to remove the pregnancy. It's over in 5 minutes. Most people are ready to go home the same day, etc. It's designed to trivialize. It's designed to normalize. And it is quite literally whitewashing a genocide. They've washed away the blood, and they've concealed the humanity of the baby, which we know so clearly. As I said, Christian, quite aside from what we can see with the naked eye, with the technology we do have, we can see sophisticated life at very early stages, which they even pretty much admit. They say, well, if you look very closely, you will see the embryo there. We know there's a life there. We know the heart's beating from 3 weeks after fertilization. We know there's a fingerprint from 10 weeks after fertilization, whether we can see that with the naked eye or not. But the whole agenda here is to whitewash the genocide and try and say, look, this is just a bit of tissue. There's no killing going on here. Now, the thing I want to introduce to people is a very interesting comparison point, because what we're seeing here from The Guardian is a very elaborate, ornate lie. They're not just lying about what the unborn child looks like. They're also lying about the people who are telling the truth. They're calling that misinformation. And in fact, they're kind of weaving this really rich tapestry, this kind of narrative.
Dave, you're making it sound like you could kind of buy this thing in a charity shop. It's an ornate lie. It's a precious lie. It's a, delicious lie. But you're right, though. It has this aesthetic appeal to it.
It is. It's a piece of work.
It's a crafted piece.
It's incredibly well crafted. It's thought through, because, of course, if you're going to do a really effective lie, you have to also explain how the other people are lying. You have to do your homework on that side and explain why their methods are wrong. They've got the wrong motives, how their pictures are the real fake images, and so on. And so they've had to work overtime to make their lie as plausible as possible. And what's really interesting is we see a very exact parallel about, what are we talking now, just over 200 years ago, with regards to the transatlantic slave trade. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce this Cruikshank cartoon to people who was a cartoonist, a satirist in the 1820s. Okay, so this is all about anti-slavery. Sorry, not abolition of the slave trade, but actually anti-slavery. And Cruikshank was a famous cartoonist who was clearly in favour of the status quo, was quite comfortable with slavery, and the cartoon that he produced has a very similar sort of tactic at play to what we've seen The Guardian doing here. So this is a 2-minute clip. David Olusoga analysing this cartoon for us. We'll put a link so people can see the picture itself, but David actually describes it anyway. So I'm just going to play this now for us, and then we're going to see how at various points what's going on is extremely similar to the tactics at play with The Guardian. So let me just get this up for us.
This is a satirical caricature by George Cruikshank, who was the great satirist of the early 19th century. The title John Bull taking a clear view of the Negro slavery question. And this is an image of two halves, really. On the right is the Caribbean, luxuriating under a tropical sun. And on the left is Britain. Beside John Bull is poor Pat, who is an English labourer who's unemployed and hungry. And no one's taking any notice of Pat because everybody in England, in Cruikshank's image, is focusing on the issue of slavery. Behind him is an abolitionist, a thin, humourless looking man who's encouraging children to sign petitions. The petition was the favoured, the ingenious campaigning tool of the abolitionist movement. And here Cruikshank's implying that people who sign petitions are young and naive, don't really understand the issues, and they can't vote anyway, so their opinions don't really matter. The only person in this painting who's not looking at the abolitionists is John Bull himself, who's looking through this telescope, which is, in theory, pointing towards the Caribbean. But what he's really seeing is a propaganda picture, a picture of a slave being whipped, that's been pushed in front of the telescope by another of the abolitionists. And John Bull is, again, like everybody else, shocked at this supposed horror of slavery. But the reality that Cruikshank wants us to consider on the other side of the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, is a world in which the black slaves aren't repressed or beaten or tortured or whipped, but they're cavorting under the sun. They're clearly been drinking rum, they're chubby and overweight because they're so well fed. What George Cruikshank is essentially saying is that by becoming obsessed with the supposed horrors of Negro slavery, the country's taken its eye off the people it really should care about, which are the poor and the unemployed and the destitute of Britain itself. And that this vision, this image of slavery that the abolitionists pushed and rammed down everyone's throats is a myth.
Well, there we have it. Some really interesting points of comparison there that I want to pick up on. So we'll put the link to that in the show notes so people can follow that up. Really recommend taking a closer look at that. And what you can see is there's a real effort there, isn't there, to demonize the abolitionists, isn't there? You know, to sort of point out their sort of disingenuous tactics. You know, they're targeting vulnerable, impressionable people, trying to get kids to sign their petitions, and of course that's really an ad hominem, isn't it? It's trying to suggest these are dishonest people who will use any means, even exploiting vulnerable children, to kind of advance their cause, which of course is just one other way of diverting the attention away from the real injustice, which is in that case slavery, and saying, look, the real crooks here are the abolitionists who are using these untoward tactics. Christian, did you notice any other?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, very interesting, the kind of humorless, gaunt, tool abolitionists, trying to get the petition signed. I can imagine you being drafted in that way within a few years. Obviously, you look half that way already, so it wouldn't be too hard for that to be done. But yeah, huge ad hominem attacks. Very interesting that, this sense of misleading the population, right? That the African people, the Negroes as they were called at the time, they were fine. They're doing great. It's only these, it's only these evangelicals who are trying to make us, feel bad about what's happening to them. I think that was very clearly betrayed, and clearly is exactly the same today. We're what did one of the quotes say on that website? It said, oh, I looked at it, I didn't feel sad. It wasn't what I expected. It's kind of, that website is trying to get people to look across the shore at these white, sacks, gestational sacks, and say, there's nothing to cry about here. There's no harm being done. There's no damage being done. And it's very interesting about the kids, right? I spoke to an academic, a pro-abortion academic yesterday, and I asked her, because I wanted to get an accurate figure for the March for Life that happened in September this year, and I thought no better person to ask than a pro-abortion academic for the count, because I know she stands there and she counts the people as they go past. And I said, how many people were there? And she said, well, it's hard to say because we don't count the kids. And I said, why don't you count the kids? And she said, because, we don't think the kids are fully consenting to be on the march, So again, it's the same idea that clearly, although it wasn't stated emphatically by this person, it's kind of like, you've got a bunch of wacko, obsessed Christians on this pro-life issue, and they just bolster their numbers by dragging their kids along to these marches, and their kids don't even know why they're there. Again, it's all the same stuff, just being dressed in in Primark, whereas it used to be in 18th century clothing. And kind of and so it's very the parallels are very similar,
And the charge that we're ignoring the real problems of the day, what are you doing about foster care or the climate, or are you vegetarian, or whatever it might be. It's trying to suggest that this whole baby genocide thing is just a total waste of time. There are real problems we need to get on with, and again, very similar distraction.
Well,
tactic.
What's very interesting about that particular point is, obviously, unlike the slave trade, which was happening in the Caribbean and was happening far away, abortion is happening, in our country, in these 360 clinics in women's homes as of March 2020. So it is on our territory. How do they get around this? Well, they try to claim it's some American import. Look over at America. Look over America. You don't want the UK to become like those kind of American pro-lifers. So again, that they've had to work harder on that, because obviously there is a very British argument to be made that killing babies at home, 1 in 17 women going to hospital, is not good for British women. It's not good for the British next generation. The NHS, paying for each abortion procedure and then having to pick up the cost of cleaning up the mess, again, is not very good for British taxpayers, etc. So how do they get around that? Well, let's keep on talking about how this is a real American thing, and these are just American tactics, American imports, even though the Americans that we speak to were inspired by the abolitionists in how they actually combat abortion in America. So, it's the idea here is it's a basically strong emotional kick, in the gut. It's not so much about the facts. It's not so much about getting to the truth. It's just pulling together various threads and pounding them into our kind of gut. And I think that this Guardian article really has that effect. It's kind of like, whoa, like these people on the streets, they are totally misleading me. This is so this is so it's a very visceral emotional reaction that it's designed to trigger, and it does so very effectively, just like the Cruikshank's picture that we just watched.
There's an interesting little detail that Olusoga didn't pick up on there, but there's an abolitionist putting up a poster or something urging people not to buy sugar from the West Indies, but to buy East Indian sugar, because that was not slave sugar. And the cartoonist Cruikshank has placed in that abolitionist's pocket, visibly, a sort of an invoice from the East India Company, suggesting that he's in the pay of the East India Company to promote their sugar over West Indian sugar. And so, of course, the insinuation is these guys are doing it for the cash, they're being paid, their motives are not pure. And we hear exactly the same thing today, people claiming that we're handsomely remunerated by, far right-wing American sort of Trump supporters and so on, which is kind of funny, because I would happily place a bet on every single one of those people who has made such a charge. I would happily bet that they are paid far more than any of us. I mean, these journalists are handsomely, Stella Creasy's doing all right in Parliament on the MP's wages, and the idea that we're in this for the money is kind of laughable, and yet so desperate is the pro-abortion lobby, and so weak are their arguments. This is the kind of thing they will resort to.
Well, it's worth noting, I did start this podcast by talking about some of the funding streams for The Guardian and how that opens them up to some of these political agendas. So I don't want to just be flinging mud back or throwing lies back, but there is, abortion costs around 400, between 300 and 500 pounds to the NHS every time you do it. So the non-for-profit organisations that do abortions are benefiting financially from them, and of course, people like Open Democracy and George Soros is using the multi-million pounds that he's acquired as a hedge fund manager to promote open borders, very left-wing agendas, of which abortion is part of them. So, there is money changing hands, and there are money streams that are taking place, and that can be evidenced. The question is, which ones can be evidence and which ones can't. And and I think just in the days of the abolition, the slave trade lobby had a huge amount of money, and they were paying, people like George Hibbert, who supposedly went to the same church as Wilberforce, to be a voice for the slavery lobby within a parliament. And likewise, we see, civil servants, people like Andrea Duncan and Isabel Stevens, people who have either formerly worked for large abortion providers or potentially could be, have worked in both places, now working in the civil service, forwarding the abortion agenda within the government. So the question is, where's the evidence, and where does the evidence lead? And clearly, it's not a multi-million pound business to be defending unborn babies in the United Kingdom. Yeah. And if these buffer zones come in, a lot of us could end up having criminal records. It's not in favor, and it doesn't enjoy the remuneration that institutional injustice historically always has.
But as you say, the key thing here, aside from, the purity of people's motives and so on, is what is the reality here? And the very powerful deception we see in the Cruikshank cartoon and in the Guardian article is they put forward a very compelling case for saying, look, here's the reality. This is the real deal, and there's nothing to see here, folks. There's nothing violent going on. There's no problem here. You can feel good now. It's a sort of satanic lullaby. It's sort of putting you to sleep. There's no issue here. It's okay. And I say, in order to do that, they have to construe the other side as the fearmongers, the misinformers, and so on. And so they want to say that the likes of Wilberforce, they're the ones telling the lies, that as David Olusoga at the end there said, it's a myth. This idea of slaves being badly treated, it's just a myth. Phew, what a relief. It's just a myth. I was worried I was going to have to do something about it. So it's really this kind of putting people to sleep. And of course, people are all too willing to accept that because it lets them off the hook. It's very easy. It's very convenient to be given the sort of rationale to say there's nothing wrong with what we're doing as a nation. It really does make things a lot easier. And so you see people swallowing this very quickly. But seeing something visually, they say seeing is believing. It's a very powerful way of getting people to believe that they've got the inside track. Like this girl we spoke with in Norwich the other day. She said, no, I just saw it. I've seen it in the papers. I've seen what pregnancy really looks like, and it doesn't look like that. So I think, a quote attributed to Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister from a long time back. It's attributed to him. Whether he said it first, who knows? But lies, damned lies, and statistics. The point he was making was that statistics can be manipulated and can even give cover for a bad argument. But we're seeing something similar here with pictures. Lies, damned lies, and pictures. Because the moment someone's seen a picture, they think they've seen it. Now, they might have. It could be an accurate picture, or it could be a fiction, like what Cruikshank did with this sort of West Indian utopia with all these slaves living happily ever after. And so a diligent propagandist, such as we see here represented by The Guardian, has to make out the other side to be the propagandists. And it's working. I can't really show this to you very easily, but one of our boards was vandalized in Norwich the other day, and I won't read everything that was said on it because it's probably not suitable for public airways. But what they have put in front of this is just our warning sign saying there is going to be abortion-related imagery up ahead. In fact, in this case, it was just living human embryos, fetuses. But in front of where it says abortion-related imagery ahead, it says fake abortion imagery ahead. And then it also says scaremongering on the side. So this is exactly the same thing. You know, we are that guy sticking the placard in front of the telescope in Cruikshank's cartoon. You know, the insinuation is we're the fearmongers. We're the ones making up a problem where it isn't. We're exaggerating the problem. The reality is over the water there, and you can see they're doing absolutely fine. Can I wrap us up, Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do. Yeah, I mean, all I was going to say was yeah, it's images like this, the Cruikshank image, the Guardian article, it absolves the conscience and it protects the industry. That's what they do. They absolve the conscience, they protect the industry. They make people think, oh, I've got nothing to be concerned about here. And all the while the industry will carry on going. And that's why, you know, effective social reform strategy and effective anti-abortion strategy does the opposite. It does affect the conscience and it hinders the industry. And that's what we should be aiming for. And if more articles like this come out, then we can probably construe that or surmise that we are actually having an influence, because people are having to put money behind correcting what we're doing or turning what we're doing into a myth. So in one sense it is a kind of compliment.
And the stakes are getting higher, aren't they? Because injustice has to thrive on darkness, lies, deception, and of course the more the injustice is exposed, the harder it is for the deception to hold fast. So what you're kind of seeing is the abortion lobby is resting on this ever-growing sort of air cushion of deception, and it's getting bigger and bigger and more complicated and more precarious. And when it is finally popped, it's going to be so shaming for those who've helped to build up that castle in the sky, because it's so clearly a lie. One day we'll be looking back on this Guardian article as we just look back on Cruikshank's cartoon. We'll think, goodness, how did someone of any public standing get away with such brazen propaganda, even in the 1820s? You know, about 30 years or more after the abolition movement started of the slave trade, even then trying to cling on to this idea, this myth, this convenient lie that there was no injustice at all. I'm reminded of Isaiah chapter 30, verse 10. They say to the seers, see no more visions, and to the prophets, give us no more visions of what is right. Tell us pleasant things. Prophesy illusions. In other words, tell me lies. Tell me sweet little lies. As one of our modern day prophets, Fleetwood Mac, has said. But this is it. We want to be lied to because the lies are easier than the truth. And yet we know that it's a very dangerous business to be deliberately lying. And earlier on in Isaiah, this is Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, it says this: woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And that's exactly what's going on here in this article. The propaganda is saying it's the truth, and it's calling the truth propaganda. It's taking the myth, calling it reality, and calling the reality myth. And it can be quite disorientating. But we need to see through it because, as we saw on the streets just the other day in Norwich, in particular, young people, these teenagers, being sold this convenient lie, which leads right down to the pit. You know, this is, we know that being in the dark as to what abortion is makes abortion itself far more likely. When people see it for what it is, many change their minds and choose life. So it is critical. And in this post-truth world where people can even publish doctored images and claim that they are the real accurate information. Again, it behoves us as people of truth to stand up and counter that with reality. Any closing remarks from you, Christian?
No, I think you said it all, David.
All right. Well, let's allow our listeners to get off a bit more easily this week then, because last week I think we may have topped 1 hour. So
1 hour of good stuff.
Good stuff. No, it was good. I enjoyed that. Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Again, please do share this with others. Help people to see through the lies of the media, because they are lethal, and help people to see how The Guardian and others are whitewashing a genocide. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.